we are going to be guiding a symphony through time, and it's going to take the rest of our lives to do it.
Hey, this is Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss, and this is a special episode I'm calling Beyond Death in the Vineyard. This episode stands on its own, but it also serves as an epilogue to the three-part Death in the Vineyard series I recently released. That series took a lot of work and came from my heart, and I'm proud of it. But I also realize it's kind of heavy, maybe disillusioning, even possibly depressing. It's hard out here for a wine grower, especially if we get real about the limits of our knowledge. So I wanted to look at the flip side, to excite and tempt and titillate you about how we could have a very different experience with wine growing. So this episode is an invitation. I invite you to cultivate your imagination for what's possible, to think constructively of alternative perspectives on wine growing, to recreate your understanding of what it means to be regenerative. I invite you into a new vision for wine. The most important lesson I learned this year is that it is impossible to grow wine, quote unquote, regeneratively, or even to grow wine organically or biodynamically in a meaningful way, or to make quote unquote natural wine in any way that isn't greenwashing, unless you start with an ecological foundation. But what does that mean? What does an ecological approach to wine growing and wine making look like? To answer that question, this episode will hopefully inspire you with two different examples that are unique in the world of wine as far as I know. The first is New Forest Farm. New Forest Farm, located in the driftless region of southwest Wisconsin, is one of the U.S.'s most ambitious large-scale conversions of former degraded corn farm into a perennial agricultural ecosystem.
Well, my name is Mark Shepard, and for the past 29 years now, I've been farming mostly in southwest Wisconsin. I bought a derelict, abandoned row crops farm, which in the Midwest was corn and soy. I bought it with the intention of converting it and doing a ecological restoration, turning it into a oak savanna, which is what it once was before Europeans arrived, but using the agriculture as a way to achieve that ecological restoration and by mimicking the plant community types.
Did you catch that? Mark didn't buy his farm because he thought it had the perfect geology and climate to make the best Pinot Noir or any other variety in the world. He didn't invest in land as one of the line items in his business plan for a winery. He didn't buy his land because it had the perfect aspect and slope and elevation for a vineyard, or because it was in a famous AVA. In other words, he didn't buy his farm to realize his vision for growing wine. Mark bought a degraded corn and soy farm so that he could end the cycle of destructive agriculture and restore the land to ecological health. His purpose for starting his farm was ecological restoration, and his primary tools for achieving this were observing and learning about the ecological history of his land and mimicking its plant communities in his farming. How many vineyards do you know that were planted in order to ecologically restore the land? How many vineyards do you know that were planted only after considering whether grapevines were part of the ecological history of that land? Or let's flip that question around. How many vineyards do you know that were planted after exhaustive climatological analysis and geological surveys, while the ecological research beyond that amounted to what kinds of pests will I need to guard against? How many vineyards do you know are growing on land that was cleared of plant and animal and other communities in order to plant the vines? Mark will go into detail in the rest of this conversation about the steps he took to use his involvement with the land, his agriculture, to serve the process of ecological succession and restoration. He, of course, has economic needs and practical realities to contend with, as we all do. But this perspective shift, the idea that our job as humans is to get creative and imaginative and figure out how to make a beautiful living while restoring and enhancing beauty and life, is the essence of what's different about his approach compared to nearly all other wine.
And I'll just kind of briefly go over it because it's relevant to our conversation today in California. The oak plant community type, dominated obviously by oak trees. Oak, chestnut, and beech are the three Fagaceae that are part of that whole ecosystem. Beech is more of the eastern and the northeastern variant of that. Chestnut will grow all across that range. Oak, chestnut, beech is an overstory. The prunus's, whether they're tall cherry trees, shorter plum trees, shrubs, etc. Hazelnut is a dominant shrub, gooseberries and currants as a understory in the shade, grapes climbing all over the whole mess, fungus decomposing all the biomass, and of course animals moving through the system with the wide diversity of prairie plants, flowers, etc., that were part of the system. And it was semi-open. It would have been um, less than 60% tree cover. More than 30% tree cover is kind of the sweet spot in the middle there. So a lightly shaded park-like setting with trees, shrubs, bushes, and vines, all living happily ever after for millennia, centuries. And so those were the species that we selected, and the farm was then designed. The whole entire property. We did some minor sculpting with swales and berms, channels and mounds, or terraces, whatever you want to call it, in order to capture all the water. And in our case, we wanted to spread it out to the ridges, soak it in over 40 different collection ponds that can be used for livestock watering or irrigation. And then the species that we mentioned were planted mostly in polycultures, which were more than one species per row. But sometimes it's a monoculture by row. There'll be a block of hazels, for example, and a block of apples that are near each other. And the idea was to manage as little as possible to allow it to act more like a natural ecosystem rather than force it to be like a orchard or a vineyard.
That sounds like a great vision. Did it work? Is it working?
It's been working actually quite well, for those 30 years, and the character of it has changed dramatically in the 30 years. Is that in the early years, you plant young trees and shrubs and whatnot, you really can't even see them,
Mhm.
and the cash flow is mostly from annual crops. Even started myself for a few years growing row crops, corn and beans, and I switched to other small grains and produce. Certified organic vegetables have been the number one cash flow through the years. Eventually went to put in a whole bunch of perennial vegetables, specifically asparagus. And then as the trees and shrubs began to produce, we could do less and less. First of all, I dropped the row crops of corn and beans. I've kept small grains as part of the rotation for soil building, organic matter buildup, etc. And then as the trees and shrubs produced more and more, I could do less produce. And what is also interesting about this is for 10 years, I did operate a licensed winery. We did mostly hard apple cider. And so that's part of my experience. We could have licensed either as a brewery or a winery. But if
Hmm.
we licensed as a winery, I could use other fruits both for top flavorings, or I could make varietals and work with grapes.
Right.
And so I also have some experience in the whole, the winery part
Yeah.
of
Yeah. So I guess from establishing your vineyard, or not your vineyard, your entire farm, how did you approach that? I mean, were there threats to that every farmer has? Like, did you have to use deer fencing there in Wisconsin? Like, were there other animals present in that environment that were potential threats to eating all your young tender trees and vines and shrubs and things like that?
it. I would say that probably more so in Wisconsin for sure than in most parts of California, because it's just a much more humid environment, and there's just a lot more things that thrive. They don't have to travel so far to eat whatever it is that they're eating. Everything from a deer to moles to voles to um, and actually in the earliest years it would have been mostly voles, mice, that sort of thing, the girdling critters, rabbits.
Yeah.
Uh, rabbits, oh man, they wiped out like literally thousands of blueberries once upon a time before I kind of learned how to deal with that.
Yeah.
So as far as like the deer are concerned, there's no way, no possible way you could keep the deer out. I know people with 8, 10 foot tall deer fence, and every single year they end up with deer inside there. We're in a really heavily populated white-tailed deer area, and there's hardly any keeping them out.
And well, how did you do it then?
Well, part of it is a numbers game. If you plant like 10 apple trees, for example, they'll come and they'll eat everyone down to the nub. If you plant 100 apple trees, they'll eat around the edges. Maybe they'll take down 25% of your apple trees. But if you plant 100 acres of apple trees, they'll go ahead and only eat the edges. So you have that many more trees that have survived the deer damage.
Right.
Part of it was also growing on large semi-dwarf or standard rootstock. So eventually we could get the branches up above browse line. So
Uh,
for apples was mostly a M111 or a standard size.
mhm.
And then one of the biggest tricks was planting in polycultures. Instead of having a row or a block of trees where they can just get into and just start eating tree after tree after tree, as they would have to find it. They could find one tree, but then they got to go find the next one, which may be two or three, shrubs or thorny bushes away in order to get to it. And what's interesting about any kind of ecological system that we're dealing with, there's whether we're dealing with deer fence or polycultures or also I would do essentially trap crops like for deer. Before we ever planted, we looked where all the deer trails were, and I'd plant hybrid poplar or hybrid willow right near the deer trail. So as the deer are bouncing along, they go eat their preferred browse, which would be the willow or the poplar. And I would also locate my ponds, my water. When I've got big rains, all these little ponds fill up. So all these little pocket ponds would be near where the trails are, which would be near where the willows are, which were near where the poplars are, just enough, far enough away to distract the deer for a couple of years while the the fruit trees or vines are growing. Um,
Hmm.
any kind of ecological system is set up. There is no perfect control of anything. That's the whole part of a ecosystem is it's in a dynamic balance, and the populations of your your pest critter, and I just did air quotes, you can't see that. So the pest critter populations are going up and down through time based on whatever reasons, and our crops are doing better or worse depending on what the season is like. And so you have like a million different interdependent variables with things constantly changing. And so um, adaptation to conditions the way they are and being nimble on your feet is part of it. And the most significant factor, I think, with the whole system, because how I approached growing, I still approach growing, is I'm not growing a crop, I'm growing a system. And all these different crops fit into that system. And there are some years where this crop does better than that crop. And there's always something there that I can rely on, even if there's a total loss of something else. Agroforesters have a term that they use, what's called the land equivalent ratio. Now, if I have 1 acre of corn, for example, that's 100% corn. That's a factor of one. If I have an acre of apples, that's 100% apples. That's a factor of one. Well, if I take 20% of the corn out of production and I do it in 50-foot wide alleys, so there'll be corn 50 foot and then a strip where I'll plant trees, then 50 foot of corn, then a strip where I plant trees. I'll only get 80% of the corn, that's a 0.8, but because of the width of the spaces, it's wider than an orchardist would plant an orchard of trees.
Mhm.
So I can put extra trees within the row. They'll have plenty of sun. I can get about 50% stocking density on that acre of ground. So I've got zero point 0.8 of corn and zero point 0.5 of apples. I now have 1.3 total yields. I have more yield despite the fact I get less yield on each individual crop. And that at first it was a nice intellectual exercise, and I got to
Mhm.
think about it and ponder about it and say, yeah, it'd be really nice if it worked. But oh my gosh, not only does it work, it kicks butt. And the more different crops that you can actually manage in the same place, you'll get a lower yield per crop, but the total yield on that site is greater. And that perfectly reflects what ecologists have determined through the years, that it's the total number of species per acre that determines your overall photosynthetic site yield on that particular acre of ground. And
Right.
the trick with us as farmer growers, whatever you want to call us, is we have to be able to get enough of each individual item to be able to have it efficient to plant it, maintain it, harvest it, get it to market. We have to have enough of that um, in order to access those markets, but not so many different varieties that it drives us nuts and we can't keep up with it.
Yeah. So, well, can we dig into some of the? So you mentioned distraction. Well, I think you had a term for that, but you sort of planting food that for the animals as like a distraction crop
Right.
for them, with the ponds as well, pocket ponds and things like that. And then also diversity, just like the idea of, some years, some things are going to get hit hard and other things are going to do well. But if you're relying on any one of those individually, then you're kind of screwed. But if you have backups and a diversity of things, then you've got this better system that actually can, which just makes so much sense. What about in the beginning, like you mentioned with the blueberry crops, with the plants that the rabbits were eating? What was your secret there? Like, how much loss did you have to tolerate, and what did you finally figure out?
Well, with the it was the same year that rabbits got the blueberries. It's the same year that we had a pretty reasonable wintertime snow cover, and the mice basically girdled everything beneath
Oh,
the snow on all the different fruit trees. And it
wow.
was then when I got the spiral vinyl tree guards,
Yeah.
and I used those on all of the trees. And I only had to use those for a few years, in part because so first of all we had to protect the tree immediately right now because there's mice and voles out there. They're going to girdle my trees. Well, then secondary to that is we now have to increase the habitat and increase the populations of the predators of those mice and voles. And so I put up a lot of hawk roosts. Just take I use black locust because it takes a long time before it decays. Just auger a hole in the ground and stand up this pole. And the last I remember, I think it was University of Minnesota did a bunch of research. If you put them about every 200 feet scattered across an area, you get exemplary rodent control because they'll be up there. The hawks will be and eagles will be hunting during the day, and then the owls will be hunting at night.
Mm.
Well, of course, you need habitat for those predators. And so, if you have any dead trees, snags nearby that have cavities in them, you can also mimic cavities with nest boxes. There's various different kinds of nest boxes that you can make. My favorite kind was because they were pretty readily available, is I could get wood duck boxes. And wood duck boxes are basically the same size and a preferred habitat for kestrels and merlins, which are a small
Hmm.
hawk. And I'd place those about 15 feet up off the ground on the on some pole post somewhere. So you want to kind of protect your crop from whatever the pests are, and increase the habitat quality for whatever the predator of your pest is. And it doesn't matter whether it's an insect or a rodent or whatever it is. We want to do some protection, yes, do some distraction, yes, and increase the habitat quality for predators.
Nice.
And none of which are perfect. There's
Right.
also repellents with deer, especially. Um, I used all the different repellents, everything from this stuff called Bitrex, which is like a really nasty, bitter Elmer's glue that clogs up any kind of sprayer you could ever use, and it was expensive, and I hated it. Or you could use like a hot pepper wax. And when you're using the hot pepper wax, it's like the deer are out having Mexican dinner. And if you're using the garlic sprays, they're out doing Italian. And so there was a product called Deer Away, I believe it was. And
Dear.
it was basically powdered eggs. It was egg beaters, powdered eggs. So I just take a dozen eggs, throw them in the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket and stir it around with a stick and splash that on direct, eggshells and all. It doesn't have to be rotten. And that worked really good against the deer. They just didn't like it. And it was affordable at the time. That was before eggs were selling for $75 a dozen. Um, and we had plenty of surplus from our own chickens anyways. And so I used eggs for quite a while. And
Wow.
then once
And that.
again, it was all numbers and habitat quality. Is that it was only certain times a year that the deer would bother the apple trees or fruit trees, and there's really only certain conditions when the rodents would really go to town, and that mostly had to do with um, with the ground cover getting to a certain size and setting an excessive amount of seeds, so you get a population boom, and then
Hmm.
not knocking that the ground cover back with adequate grazing or mowing, and then in my case it would have been deep snow that now the rodents aren't running around on the surface getting picked off by by hawks and whatnot, that they're tunneling under the snow on the ground level and running into your trees and girdling them that way. So those are the specific times a year when things damage was greater, and I'd have to make sure that I had protection in place.
So during the snow, it was just you had to have the trees protected
Yeah,
at
the
that
tree
point.
guard is
I see.
actually another thing too that you're not likely to do this in Central California, but when we had like a thick, heavy snow, I'd go out wearing snowshoes and just stomp around the tree, just walk around the trees, and it would pack
Right.
it down to make like this restricted layer, just make it a little bit more difficult for them to
Right.
crawl along this ground surface and get to your trees. That
And
was impossible with thousands and thousands of trees, but I would do that whenever the snow was around like that, just going from point A to point B. I'm going to make sure I'm dancing around trees.
what did you do? Did you do anything different for the blueberries
Well,
in the
yeah,
lab?
the blueberries were was part of what was interesting is I planted like a windbreak of spruce trees with blueberries staggered. So you got like a row of spruce trees. Then in the spaces between next row down, I would put blueberries. So it's like the zigzag line of spruce and blueberry. It didn't have any problems at all until all of a sudden the spruces were large enough to act as little hidey shelters for all the rabbits. So the rabbits would hide under the spruce trees, come out and eat the blueberries. And it was about that time we had a lot of snow,
Mm,
because Wisconsin doesn't always have thick, heavy, snowy winters. It's quite variable. But when we
mm,
have it, sometimes we can have like a lot of it. And so that was the same year that I had a lot of rodent damage on the other fruit trees, and I got the spiral tree guards. And the when I put the spiral tree guards on the blueberries, because they had already been eaten down once, I cut them in like a third or a half, depending on the size of the remaining stem, just to kind of protect that base of the stem and allow that plant opportunity to grow back. And even if the rabbits did go ahead and hit it again, they would only clip off the top. And so I'd have that stem alive at least. And I knew
hmm.
that I was gaining root, and I was gaining ground, and eventually they would come through it. And the reason why I could wait a little bit and have some patience and take some losses during those critical development stages for the blueberries is because I had other crops that I was depending on, and I didn't absolutely depend on the blueberries for the income. And the same was true with apples. I mean, in the early years, I was making my money off of vegetables and grazing cattle. I was not making any money off the apples, and so I could go ahead and have a couple of years of damage to the trees and have them recover from it more slowly. Whereas if I was just 100% apples or 100% grapes or whatever, I'd have to somehow hurry up and get my income from those crops. Whereas I had other options short term to ride me through until we could kind of naturally heal and let the whole ecosystem develop a little bit more. Predator populations kind of build up. You get a new balance that settles in.
D-
It's a game of patience. It's a game
Yeah, I
of
was going to say, what time frame would you, looking back, say someone should think about allowing to have these sort of starts and stops and replants and loss and gain and
well,
finding that.
welcome to planet Earth. It's a lifetime. You know, I think it's a fallacy. It's a fallacy to imagine that we can do something and it's going to work perfectly. That's where we have so many problems. And let's just take an apple orchard. I've used this phrase over and over again. 100% of all of the problems that you will encounter in an apple orchard are because we have this intellectual concept called orchard. An orchard is not a real thing. It's an idea that we came up with, that we said that apples should perform this way. And the reason why they should perform that way is because we need to, invest this capital right away and get it into production right away. We have to have a certain scale. We have to have all these employees. And when a bug comes in to eat an apple, instead of saying, oh, yeah, that's normal, that's natural, that's how this world works, we go, oh my gosh, I have a problem. I have to fight against it. name the problem in an apple orchard, and it's because we have this concept of orchard. Whereas if we grow a natural ecosystem with a diversity of plants and animals and so on, we're going to have all of those problems. We'll have all those problems, and they won't be 100% catastrophic because we have all this diversity of crop from which we're deriving our livelihood.
Huh. Yeah, that's great.
And you don't have to believe that. Go out and test it. Go
Yeah.
test it.
It just takes a lifetime to test it. That's the
Well,
problem.
and that's the whole point. What do you want to do? Farm for 5 years and quit? No, I'm in this for the rest of my life.
You also have talked a lot about the stun method. If could you talk about that? Does that apply equally to these other lives that want to eat your crops, or is that more about just its like the fitness of a plant for its particular place in that
Yeah, the
total
term
environment?
stun, STUN,
Uh huh.
uh, originally I thought meant sheer total utter neglect, but I've come to learn through the years that it's actually strategic total utter neglect. That
Okay.
you have to know when your plants need attention and when you can kind of like just back off on them. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of discovered it in part because I was doing more than I could keep up with. Let's go back to the orchard concept. I was still thinking like orchard, and everything had to look like an orchard, and I couldn't keep up with it. I didn't have enough time in the day, or money for equipment, etc. And so part of my plantings kind of got overgrown and disappeared into the weeds and the brush. And what I found out is that the ones that got overtaken by weeds and brush, although they developed more slowly, it was a lot less work overall, because on the ones where I was quote unquote taking care of them, uh, you get rid of the tall grasses, and all of a sudden deer can see it. Now I've got to protect against deer.
Mm-hmm.
Then if you go ahead and protect against the deer, and you want those plants to grow fast, maybe you're putting a little extra fertility on it. Now they grow so fast, they're attracting aphids and other kind of sucking insects. So all these different other problems that
Hmm.
were cascading out from the fact that I was trying to force these plants to grow in an orchard type situation, whereas the ones that I kind of just ignored grew more slowly, but they had far fewer problems, and they're definitely more durable. And then the real power of the whole stun technique is with genetics, because I use primarily seedling plant material. I figured nature knows what's going on when it came up with this like sexual reproduction thing, because we want to have variability between the generations so that our plants can adapt to the changing pest and disease pressures. Our plants can adapt to the changing climate conditions, rainfall patterns, hot and cold patterns. The individual plant, let's say like in my case a Macintosh apple, it won't change. But when I save its seed, it's been pollinated by a bunch of these other different things. Those young apples are different than its parents, and that's the magic of sexual reproduction. And so the stun is especially good at finding the plants that are pest and disease resistant. And if I plant like 100 trees and do nothing to them, no fungicides or pesticides or anything like that, if all of a sudden 30 of those trees get some sort of disease and die, that's not a loss for me. That's actually a gain, because I know that those were susceptible to disease. The ones
Right.
that left behind, somehow they were resistant, and I don't care how they were resistant. And then out of those ones that are left behind, the ones that produce the most fruit, that has the genetics for high productivity. And so I would select through the years for early reproduction in the lifetime of the plant, that's precocity, then for high yield and pest and disease resistance. And once upon a time, Wisconsin was a pretty good place to select for cold hardiness, because we used to get 40 below every single winter time. We haven't had that in 3 years now. So
Hmm. So to what extent are you doing things like fungicides or pesticides or anything like that?
none whatsoever. None
Oh,
whatsoever.
okay.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Because now let's think about this. Okay, I'm sticking with apples because I've used apples, more often as an economic driver than other crops, as well, other fruit crops. If I have to get 5 bushels of grade A number one fruit per tree in order for me to cash flow, that means I will have to spend money on sprays. So now this cash flow is coming, it gets eaten into with all the sprays that I have to spray, the amount of time that it takes for me to spray it, the equipment that I need to spray it, and so on and so on. Whereas if I don't spray and I don't spray at all, well, I'll never get the 5 bushels of grade A number one fruit. Well, so what? What if I only get 1 bushel of grade A number one fruit? My expenses were almost zero. I didn't have all the equipment costs that are in there. And but when I got started, I was operating under the theory and or hope that the margin would be better at the end of the day. And absolutely unequivocally it is. In my particular case, it may be different elsewhere where you have different, cost and expense structures, equipment's more, et cetera. And if you're already well established in certain markets and you have to have so many dollars worth of sales per year in order to cash flow, you're kind of in a little bit of a rock and a hard place. Whereas if you're starting out, you can already start out. Let's just use any kind of tree as an example. Let's have a grape vineyard with sheep. Well, let's plant chestnuts in there. Are you making any money off of chestnuts this year? No. Since you're not making any money off of chestnuts this year, do you really care how well they produce, and do you really have to push them to hurry up and come into production? Nope, because you're not making any money off of them anyways. So then all of a sudden, when they start to make some money, you haven't done anything to take care of these things. Any care that they got was a byproduct of you taking care of the sheep and the grapes. And all of a sudden, wow, now I have an extra crop that the expenses of those crops have been paid by the other crops that are your cash flow crop. And in the case of a winery, it's all about the wine. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. I think so I guess the question would be like, let's say you were, I mean, again, using an orchard or vineyard or whatever, or a vineyard, like a combination of trees and vines together as a thing. You know, there is this model that people have that 99.9% of everybody uses, where you go in and you plant in the spacing that you want. Let's say if it's vines, you're doing 8 by 10 spacing, or 6 by 12, or whatever, 6 by 10, or whatever your spacing is. And say if it's an orchard, it's 15 by 15, or whatever. Again, now there's like 2 by 10 or whatever in orchards. But what you are envisioning, like you said, with this idea of an orchard, is that every one of those trees represents a dollar sign that has to produce and pencil out on your spreadsheet that you used to justify the investment in planting that orchard. How are you seeing it differently? Like, how would you go about this differently? And these are all clones of certain varieties that people want. So you were talking about seedlings, and you're talking about sort of overplanting. Like, how would you, or how have you approached, or what specific numbers in relation to that are you thinking about, if you're even thinking about numbers, or how does that come in out of your mind when you're thinking differently about that?
It's a huge question with a lot of detail thrown in there, and I'm going to have to go analog on it because that's part of it. Is what we're talking about here is we are going to be guiding a symphony through time, and it's going to take the rest of our lives to do it. What I want to do is for the listening audience is, in your imagination right now, think about a timber company that buys a piece buys a piece of ground, and it's an abusive timber company. It clear cuts everything. So now it's starting with a clear cut. From that point on, right there, that's a positive cash flow, long term investment that makes financial sense for the timber company. In part because they're treating it like a natural resource property, not like an orchard. So they go out, maybe let's say they're going to replant this whole thing with their species of choice. Then for the next 2 or 3 years, they're going to do some sort of weed control, vegetation control, to get rid of the ones that would compete with their ultimate crop tree. So then after they go through that early phase, so there's planting, that's one. Then two, let's say 3 years worth of weed control. There's four entries in 4 years.
Mhm.
Then years 5 through 15, maybe they never go back there again. Then in year 16, perhaps they go in and they do a thinning. in order to reduce the stem density to allow the other trees to grow faster. At that
Mm.
time, they're going to select for the ones that are growing the fastest according to their qualifications of what they want to see. Then maybe at 25 years they go in and they do a light harvest for pulp paper, and then at 50 years they go in and they harvest for saw timber, and then they start again. So in 50 years they only went into that site 7 times.
Hmm.
Now what I want to do is design a system that has as few entries into that, few expense entries into that system as possible. So I'll share the planting and I'll put stuff in the ground. Well, now I need weed control for a number of years. So for weed control, I'm going to use, annual produce crops or annual grains or livestock. So we're doing weed control for my trees by having a revenue stream from a different crop. And if you're just taking produce, for example, you've got to plant it, you got to do some, fertilizer, some weed control. Well, as I'm doing weed control on my vegetable crops in the alley, it's doing weed control for my trees. If I'm doing any fertility amendments for my vegetable crops, it's helping to fertilize the trees. So my cash crop that's penciling out is the vegetable crop. And as a byproduct, my trees get better care. And then as time goes on, I want to make sure that now, if I'm going to start thinning my trees, when I thin some of those trees out, I do it at the right time of year and I inoculate it with mushroom spawn. And now I'm having culinary or medicinal mushrooms as a co-product from the thinning process. And
Mm.
so every entry that a timber company would have, say 7 out of 50 years, I'm going to have 77 entries. Yes, I'm even going to have more because I'm going to relate with it on a regular basis. But
Mm.
every entry that I do will be a profit making venture instead of an expense.
Mm.
And after a period of years, once I'm no longer interested in doing vegetable crops, for example, the trees are bigger or whatever, then I'll go ahead and start to shift a portion of the whole overall operation to livestock and have more and more livestock grazing in the system. And so the idea is to have this long term ecosystem with multiple different species that are represented in it. And that's why it's important to mimic your local native plant community types. And let's just take the California floristic province. Northern California is radically different from Southern California, and
Yeah.
similar species live there. So you want to take variants from the hotter, drier part of the region and variants from the colder, wetter part of the region, mix them in your area, and then select for stuff that's adapted to your conditions and move forward through time. And so I used like a musical analogy, symphonic kind of thing, and now I'm talking about an ecosystem. We are in the process of managing ecosystems, not necessarily crops.
Right. And
And
are
so to start with a crop, like grapes, for example, now you're starting to talk about adding stuff in. There's a sequency issues that are going on. You already have cash demands that you have to have this much revenue coming from a system. So if we enter into an already existing system, there's the challenge of how do we enhance this system without dropping income right off the bat. And that's a
right.
different proposition than starting from scratch.
Are you? Oh, I mean, am I right to assume that you are, because of the way that you're doing this, planting like way more trees or shrubs or all the above when it's a perennial than like would normally be planted?
Yeah, let's use chestnuts as an example this time. If eventually we want chestnuts to be 30 foot on center, um, I'm going to start by planting them, no further apart than 6 foot on center.
Yeah.
And then as time goes on, by having that much of a stem density, now when I start to find out which trees produce at the youngest age, which trees produce the most nuts, I'm going to remove the ones that don't perform the way I want and immediately inoculate those with shiitake mushrooms. That's just a simple example of how I would migrate a planting that's close to like 4,000 stems per acre to eventually 70 stems, 60, 70 stems per acre when they're 30 by 30. It would take 15 or 20 years to get there.
Yeah.
Well, That's where we're going. However, I'm now starting to get seed from my plants that are doing really, really well. So when I remove stuff, I'm going to put new stuff in
Right,
because
right,
what we also don't know is what we also don't know if there's new pests and disease showing up that this tree right here is doing great for like 5, 6, 7, 10 years, then maybe some new insult comes along and it starts falling apart after 15. If we aren't constantly replanting behind ourselves and in front of ourselves, we'll lose that productive middle. And that's what's really fascinating about my situation right now is that uh, my place does not look like an orchard. My place, in using chestnuts again as an example, I have probably more chestnut blight on my place than almost any other place in the USA because I don't do anything to control it. And I keep having more and more chestnuts. And yet at the same time, I've got all these diseased trees all over the place. I'm actually producing literally tons of chestnuts per year because I don't care if you have a sniffle. You go to work. And I'm not going to get my undies in a bunch over the fact that this tree is dying because if it's dying, good riddance. There has to be something there to replace it, of course.
right.
So I'm always planting stuff behind me as trees fall apart. And I actually do have, I don't know, several hundred anyways, chestnut trees that still, as of yet, have not been. These are like old 25-year-old trees that have yet to be affected by any kind of blight, and so it's possible that I've discovered or helped to discover blight-resistant genetics in the chestnuts, or it's just maybe they just haven't got it yet.
Is
And
this
also think about this: is how do I know that one of my trees is resistant to a disease unless I have the disease around?
right,
Fire blight in apples. Unless I let fire blight run, I don't have enough fire blight around to test my other trees.
right? To to what so are you planting all American?
No,
Oh, okay,
no. With the chestnuts, it's American, European, Chinese, Japanese, and Seguin. And I
okay.
also have some for the first time this year. I got some. I decided to go for it. Allegheny chinkapin, which I don't know if it'll survive a cold winter.
Okay. Well, when you work with people, what is the hardest? I mean, what do you see? I mean, I think we've talked about it, but it's the attachment to this idea. Like, how do you see that come out when you work with people, and how do you get people over that attachment to the, what we think of as the idea of an orchard or a vineyard?
Well, you were about to, I suspect, you were about to ask me what some of the biggest challenges were, and then you immediately went to the that challenge
Yeah.
of becoming the attachment because that's it right there. Is people they want to see this idea of orchard and it should look this way, and it should look picture perfect like all the magazines and whatever. So if all of a sudden they hear this wacko talking about polycultures and natural ecosystems, um, then they go online because they're afraid or whatever. All they're going to find is they're going to find all the universities, all the PhDs, all the horticulturists. Everybody's saying it's monoculture, take care of this, whether it's organic or chemical, and you're surrounded by this image of nature and or landscapes. Oh my gosh, like landscapes especially, they have to be picture perfect and groomed, and that's not the way this planet has ever worked. It doesn't.
Right.
Anytime you see anything that's that quote unquote neat and under control, it's a highly forced system, and you're forcing it to do something that it doesn't want to do on its own, and that's expensive in time, money, inputs, etc. So instead of trying to convince people that this works, I used to in the past. I figured we got to change people; they got to change their thinking, blah blah blah. It's times have changed enough that enough people started trying it, and now the situation is I want to help the people who actually want to make this conversion.
Yeah.
And if you have all these objections in the world as to why it won't work or can't work, I'm not interested in hanging out with you because I'm too busy helping the people who actually want to make the change.
Yeah. So, have you had to do any trapping or killing of rodents specifically? Because
Well, actually, that's an interest. I'm glad you brought that up because I'd forgotten that we were going to talk about that. I'm glad you did. We're going to be setting up ecological systems, both life and death are part of ecological system. A lot of people like, oh, nature's all about cooperation. It's like, well, no, there's also competition. There's
Right.
predation. There's all these different interrelationships between species. And if we are going to insert a human into an ecosystem, there will be interactions that we have to take on, and some of those involve terminating life forms. I'd already mentioned thinning trees. A lot of people don't object. Oh yeah, you got to thin the trees, or carrots. You grow carrots. If you don't thin out your carrots, your remaining carrots won't get big and fat. So you have to kill a couple of carrots to get some carrots. So when it comes to managing an ecosystem, if you're going to be doing, organic or chemical, you're using those things as the bringers of death. Whereas, in a more ecological type system, I'm going to be setting up, like I said, habitat for raptors to be the agents of death. I'll be setting up traps. Yes, I'll set traps and catch things that way. And sometimes, like with deer, I'll intervene myself and use high velocity lead poisoning. Um, so there needs to be an interaction between the human and the ecosystem, and that does include killing things sometimes, even if you don't want to. I mean, you're walking on the ground, you're killing ants and earthworms. It's just you make the choice. That's the thing, is you make the choice based on your set of moral values on how much you want to interact with the system. And if your choices are not adequate enough to get the control that you think you want, then you're going to lose crops.
When you say high velocity lead poisoning, is that bullets?
It's called firearms.
Fires. That's what I thought you meant. Okay. Right.
Trying to be nice, trying to be nice.
um, I guess you have written a book called Restoration Agriculture and about all of this in some form or another. And I'm I'm wondering to what extent you find yourself what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of riffing or like finding the need to expand the definition of regenerative or correct people's misunderstanding or how how what your relationship with the idea of regenerative agriculture as it is coming, it is becoming popular now based on your own approach to restoration agriculture.
Right. Well, what's really interesting, and as I'm going to go even further back than that, I'm
Yeah.
old enough to remember at least a half a dozen different jargon changes that the marketers and the enforcement agencies have come up with in order to keep themselves busy and feeling relevant.
Uh-huh.
Everything from wholesome to natural to organic to certified organic to name your label, and of course now regenerative. The um, term regeneration actually has a 400-year history of active debate, conversation, and definition, and basically the ability of a population of organisms, an ecosystem to regenerate, to be regenerative, means that it has the ability to survive where it is, the way the conditions are right now, including all the storms, floods, volcanoes, nutrient deficiencies, nutrient surpluses, fire, trampling by animals, and it uh, it it regenerates itself, and it spreads, and it expands its population. That's the ecological definition of regeneration. So, if you're able to grow broccoli in a system that you don't have to do anything to that broccoli, it can get hit by a landslide, volcano, fire, earthquake, floods, whatever, and then it comes back, and then it plants more broccoli for you, and it expands its population. That's regenerative according to the ecological definition of regeneration, not according to the marketing definition, and not according to the certifying enforcement agency definition. And so I stand by the ecological definition of regenerative. And if a system is uh, a really close mimic of a natural ecosystem that belongs in Northern California, Southern Georgia, Northern Minnesota, wherever it is, it will persist, and it will persist with very little care on our part. We can go in and we can steer it, we can help it, we can enhance it, and obviously we can benefit from it by harvesting from it. And if some disaster comes by, an ice storm, for example, and knocks everything down, it all sprouts back and it's there again next year. That's a regenerative system according to ecological definition.
Yeah, I like that. I guess as a final question, it seems like a big shift in perspective. Even though what you're talking about sounds really practical, and it sounds like like on the face of it, yeah, it would look different, but there is some association, some analogy to an industrial commodity food crop system. But I think there's something really profound in the perspective shift, and I wonder how how you would put that? Like, how would you describe that perspective shift, and how did you get there?
The perspective shift, I think it's quite profound, and I think that anything that I would say might be inadequate to really convey what it is. But what I'll try right now for at least a piece of it, instead of us going to a piece of property and say, "I am going to do this. I am going to set up a regenerative, grape apple system, and this is what it's going to look like, and it's going to have to perform this way economically." What that is that's all about the human being coming to a place and saying, "This is what I want to do, and I'm going to do it, damn it, because I have enough money to have the knowledge, the know-how, the drones, the AI, all that kind of stuff, and I'm going to make it happen." Um, the flip side of that is to go to a place and say, "Hey, I'm the human being. You're the natural system here. How can I work with you and help you to do better?" And then once I work with you and help you to do better, now it's my job as a human being to figure out how to sell all the different products that come off that system. And if you're growing, like in my case in Wisconsin, oaks, chestnuts, and beech, and apples, and cherries, and grapes, and hazelnuts, and grass, and animals, how can I plant more of those things in mutually beneficial relationships? And then how can I learn how to manage them so that my expenses almost approach the expenses of a natural system, which is zero, and that my yields are adequate to pay my bills? And that's the human challenge, I think, is to how do we assemble these, how do we reassemble the damaged ecosystems of planet Earth, interact with them in order to derive our food, fuels, medicines, fibers, building materials, and an economic livelihood so we actually have a future.
I've been fascinated with this question of how do we incorporate ecological succession into our wine growing. I think Mark has made the case that we can't do this while still attached to the idea of a vineyard or orchard. When we observe and attempt to mimic nature, one of the most obvious lessons that we can learn is that no ecosystem stays the same unless humans force it to. Change and succession happen continually in all ecosystems. By not embracing this in our wine growing, we've set ourselves up for constant conflict. If I try to stand still in the ocean, I'll be knocked down again and again and may drown, and I will see the ocean as my enemy. But if I learn to surf, with time, I'll learn to let the power of the ocean lift and carry me so that I can experience the joy of riding waves, and I'll see that the ocean was always my source of support. By trying to keep a piece of land in a row of one kind of crop for generations, we seem to be violating one of the most basic realities of how the world works. It's like trying to stand still against the force of the ocean. We may be used to being buffeted by waves. We may have accepted the cost of continually spraying or fertilizing or tilling or killing animals and other organisms in large numbers. But it takes a toll, and the ocean will eventually overwhelm us. And I think we're beginning to see this and feel this now. So I want to give you an inspirational, ecological alternative number 2. This example is even more extreme than Mark's. This is an example of a winemaker who doesn't plant anything, nor spray anything, nor kill anything. Well, I mean, not intentionally, nor even have the need of the word quote unquote pests. He doesn't mow or till or fertilize or prune or use any inputs of any kind except his time and energy to harvest. And this is possible because he works with only what grows indigenously on his land. This is Wild Texas Wines.
Yeah. I'm Austin Glasscock. I own and operate Wild Texas Wines in Sonora, Texas. It's a super, super small uh, family fruit wine business that we have out here. Um, we do essentially we only make wine from wild fruit that we harvest here on the property or other nearby ranches in this county. Um, and then we do our best to essentially not do any intervent intervention style work. We don't irrigate. We don't manage any pests. Essentially, all we do is track um, the wildlife and the trees and the plants, and then we just essentially keep a log of that over time, and then it gives us a good baseline year over year on how the weather, um, really the weather the most affects the wildlife, which affects the plants, and then we're able to plan and adjust our harvesting year over year based on that. So it was definitely more difficult at the beginning because there's not a lot of information out there that I'm aware of. Even on the educational side, I couldn't find a lot of stuff on this. So really, we started from scratch on what plants were getting harvested when, and then how dry years and wet years and warm and cold years affect the shift in the harvest window for those different plants, and then how active the wildlife are those years going after the fruit on those plants as well. So I can kind of adjust my harvesting based on that.
What? Why are you wild harvesting? What are you wild harvesting? And like, yeah, like what is your wine all about?
Yeah, we the initial the whole concept of the business was built on um, being able to run it very low overhead and harvesting wild fruit that we don't have to manage in any way besides monitor its progress allows us to keep the overhead very low as opposed to managing and buying and keeping up grapes.
Oh, so it's all financial, and here I thought it was ecological.
It's both. It's both. It, it's both economical and ecologically beneficial for me. And that was really the business constraints and the monetary constraints forced me to get creative on how we were going to do it. And essentially, I think that's part of the reason I think that there's not a lot of this in the industry is because generally there's large or a decently large monetary backing going into starting or opening a winery as opposed to these smaller places that start from essentially their house and then try to slowly grow organically. And maybe that's why we don't see as much creativity in the wine industry because there's so much money behind traditional wine. Um, but we do um, almost everything that grows out here. Fruit's something edible, which is surprising to a lot of people, but our oak trees grow acorns and you can make flour and stuff out of those. We don't make a wine out of the acorns, but we have ash and Virginia juniper trees here. People call them cedar trees in Texas. And we make wine from that. We make wine. Our major wine is from prickly pear tunas, the fruit off the prickly pear. We make a ton of that, a sweet and a dry. And then we harvest mesquite beans. We have honey mesquite here on this ranch. There are, I think, a couple different types of mesquite trees in Texas, but the majority of them here are honey mesquites. And we make that from the bean pods that grow on the trees. And then we make one from wild persimmons that grow here. They're Mexican persimmon. They're like a cousin to the Eastern persimmon you would see in a grocery store. They're small, about the size of a grape, black, and they taste kind of molassesy, very sweet. Surprisingly, we get a lot of excitement from both generations. The older generation because they grew up out here with the plants, and so they're very familiar with them. They spend a lot of time outside here in the wilderness, so they're familiar with the plants. And then we get a lot of appreciation from the younger generation because they appreciate the sustainability and eco-friendly theme, essentially, of the whole idea. So we get a lot of excitement about it, and the wines are definitely representative of the area. They're crazy. We've got a couple crazy ones. The juniper one tastes like you're drinking a cedar tree.
Can you talk about the scale element? So obviously, you said you're very small. it seems like what you're doing would be hard to scale, obviously, because it's like, it relies on foraging. You're doing pretty much all that yourself, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
And and so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that. Like, do you care that you're small? Like, do you have a plan to lease, thousands of ranches so that you can just expand, production and like hire a bunch of harvesters to continue to blow this up? Or how do you feel about being small?
Yeah, I had anticipated on being small and staying small for quite a while. I had planned to let this grow organically, um, or as organically as possible. But um, this part of Texas, in particular, um, is unique in the fact that there's a lot of wild country out here that's still privately owned and has been largely um, unbothered for the most part. So we definitely have the native resources to expand, but it would take me bringing on some people to harvest and then um, upgrading my actual like winemaking tanks and stuff to a little bit larger size, and really would just take a few more people on hand. But we're in a good spot to expand if we need to or want to um, with the resource. And people here are fantastic. A lot of people don't even like the prickly pear or the mesquite trees on their property or the cedar trees, so they don't mind at all if we come out and harvest. Um, they wouldn't mind if we came out and took all of them and got rid of them for them. So it's crazy. When I laid out the idea originally, that was the plan, was to minimize the operational cost as much as possible by utilizing what's here naturally, and then and it's worked well for the wine, and it worked great for the tasting room. We built the tasting room with all of the rocks that were on this property and trees that were on this property. So the cost to build our tasting room was super low, and we did it all ourselves. So um, the idea of gearing your business around what you have that's plentiful and free is definitely a model I would recommend. Yeah, and the harvest window for essentially all of our fruits is 2 to 3 months for each thing. The only thing that's not is mesquite beans. They get ripe very quickly, um, and they're off the tree and on the ground, and then everything gets them. So, and we get the least amount of those is what are mesquite beans that we get. So we don't get very many of those, um, barely enough to do a batch of mead a year because of the short harvest window, and everything out here loves them. The deer, the cattle, goats, birds, everything eats them because they're super sweet. Um, but the Texas persimmons, the juniper trees, and the prickly pear all get ripe over 2 to 3 months. So essentially, we'll go out and we'll harvest what is ripe and untouched on the plant that day, and then we'll go through all the ones that we want to hit that day, and then we'll normally wait about a week, like 5 days to a week, and then we'll go back out and re-hit all of the plants that we know have fruit, um, and that gives us time to let enough fruit ripen up on the plant for it to be worth us walking out there, and also lets the wildlife get their fair share. So I can appreciate the skill involved in differentiating your wines among so many others of the exact same type and grape. But it really doesn't impede me or our business here at all. The people appreciate the uniqueness for sure. So if anything, it helps us stand out. Everyone's been super curious and intrigued. I've met a bunch of other small winery owners and stuff, and I carry some traditional wines from other small Texas places for people who don't like my stuff and they want like a traditional grape wine. There's definitely a lot of other opportunities to utilize the fruit out here for other things besides making wine. They used to, a long time ago, they used to have a mesquite bean flour mill in the next town over from here. And when they died, the mill kind of disappeared and shut down. But we make mesquite bean mead, and then we also make a mesquite bean flour that I use to make pancakes at the tasting room every Sunday for brunch. I get the most enjoyment, honestly, out of um, just keeping the business functioning as a proof of concept to people that you can still be creative and make a good product that's sustainable and regenerative and works with the ecosystem. And you can still make a living doing it. You're not going to be drowning in money, but if you enjoy that kind of work and you're rewarded from that kind of work, that's what I love, is being able to show people that you can still, you don't have to work in an office. You can come out, you can get creative, do a shitload of hard work, and still make a living.
It's hard for me not to overhype what Austin is doing. His unassuming, quiet manner belies a very rare way of thinking about wine that is, frankly, revolutionary. He works within the natural limits of his land to make his wine and run his business. He learns better how to operate within those limits by observing and tracking the plant and animal responses to seasonal and climatic changes. He doesn't need to manage the plant or animal populations because he hasn't altered either of them or their communities, and they have existed together on that land for a long time before him. He wild gathers or forages enough to serve his human community and himself while leaving enough for his animal and bird and insect communities to also have plenty. I should also mention that he occasionally makes a sparkling prickly pear wine, traditional method, that is one of the most beautiful wines I've had in the last 10 years. Imagine how diverse and interesting our wine world would be if there were Austins everywhere, highlighting the indigenous abundance of each local region. I did a full interview with Austin for an episode of this podcast a couple years ago that I highly recommend. One of the parts that sticks with me now is the description of how he harvests. Harvesting for him is spending time walking through a landscape that he loves. It's meditative, peaceful, and joyful, and you can hear the gratitude with which he approaches this process. I recently listened to an elder at the Onondaga Nation tell about the rules they observe when harvesting. The Onondaga are one of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the world's oldest, still existing democracy, and their land is the area now known as New York State. This elder told of how she was visiting with a member of an indigenous group from islands near Australia, on the other side of the world from the Onondaga Nation, and she shared their rules with him for harvesting, and his response was, "We have the exact same rules." And so she suggested these rules may be universal, and I wanted to share them with you now. Here are those 4 rules. Number 1, never take from the first or second. Some say never take more than a third to a half. The point is to never take all of something and to leave more than half for others. If you find 3 mushrooms, you may take 1. If you find 2, don't take any. What if we applied this rule even to things that we plant? Number 2, give thanks before taking. Thank the cactus, the tree, the vine. Thank the stream. Thank it for giving its fruit, its wood, or its water, and thank it for continuing to enable you to have life because of its gifts. Number 3, never take more than you need. This rule reminds us to learn the difference between a need and a desire. It reminds us that the way to find abundance is to limit our desire for more. And number 4, never take what isn't given, or only take what is given. This last one may be the most difficult to accept, I think, because most of us live in a culture built on taking what isn't given. So we have no understanding or frame of reference for this. I'm creating this, and you are listening to this on pieces of technology that could not have been built without taking what isn't given, I think. The homes we live in and the roads we drive on are the same. Many of us live on land that was originally taken and not given. So when it comes to our wine, it's easy to rationalize and excuse violating this rule and the others as a cultural necessity. But I encourage you not to dismiss them, these rules for harvesting. What would it mean if you applied these universal rules to your wine? It's a wild question, but don't scare it away. Don't call the authorities. Let it live in the back of your mind. Give it a little safe, warm corner there, maybe some old rags to curl up in. Give it some food and water in a bowl and an occasional scratch behind its ears. We never know what these feral ideas will become, or how meaningful our relationship with them will become when we first meet them in the bushes. Wine is many things to many people, of course, but if I had to describe the essence of what I want from wine, if I had to give my definition that explained its purpose in relation to the full scope of human endeavor, I would say something like this. Wine is joy. Wine is love. It is not an inevitable reality. It is a human gift that we craft And like music, it demonstrates the capacity of humans to generate beauty from our participation in the unfolding of the universe. On our journey through the oceans of history, in which we leave in our wake many artifacts of violence, war, empire, enslavement, and horror, we also leave reminders that we are more than that. Wine is one of those reminders. Messages in bottles strewn in the waves of our rushing voyage, from which we and those who come after us may be reminded that we also make this. We are also capable of this. I want the way I grow and make wine to be worthy of this. I don't want to dilute the beauty and empty wine of its meeting by succumbing to the status quo. I think it's possible for my wine to heal the land, to work with all the members of our ecosystems, to enrich our communities, to clean and protect our environment. It just might take a different kind of thinking and wine and a bit more imagination. To move wine beyond Death in the Vineyard, we may need to move beyond the vineyard, or at least our current conception of it. I hope this has given you some inspiration about how we might begin to do this. A big thank you to Mark Shepard and Austin Glasscock for giving us these examples of how we might think and do wine differently. If you want some more inspirational winemakers like Austin and Mark, there are actually many creative winemakers who let local ecology guide and influence winemaking, and they work all along the path that veers off of the colonial extractive mindset and can give you practical inspiration wherever you are on your journey with wine. The list is too long, or I would start naming names, but several have episodes on the Beyond Organic Wine podcast, so look into the library. Some forage for wild fruit, while others gather the excess of urban fruit trees. Some blend and co-ferment and infuse with many ingredients, including grapes, while others make only non-grape wine. Some carry old traditions of local fermentations into the present, while others invent new cultures and explore the unknown. This is the vibrant and colorful counterculture of wine, and we invite you to be part of it and to help shape this diverse, resilient, joyful, and truly regenerative approach to wine. And as always, thank you so much for listening.